Have you ever had the feeling that truth is becoming something malleable? As if, somehow, facts could be shaped according to the convenience of those who control them. If you've ever felt this way, you're not alone. And more importantly, someone predicted this phenomenon with eerie precision. George Orwell, one of the most influential writers of the 20th century, dedicated his life to exposing the dangers of truth manipulation and totalitarianism. His works were not just stories, they were warnings, alerts about how language, information, and even our own thoughts can be distorted to serve power interests. But here's the most unsettling point. Orwell wasn't writing about a distant and improbable future. He was writing about patterns that were already emerging in his time and that today seem more relevant than ever. In a world where misinformation spreads in seconds, where truth is frequently questioned, and where surveillance has become part of our daily lives, his words resonate like a dark echo of the present. But who was Orwell, really, before becoming? The author of 1984 and Animal Farm, he was just Eric Arthur Blair, a young man born in 1903 in British India. From an early age, he demonstrated a critical eye toward the world around him. He grew up in a lower middle-class family but was surrounded by aristocratic aspirations that made him aware, from a young age, of society's contradictions. His commitment to truth was not just theoretical, he lived his ideas. He abandoned a promising career in the British Imperial Police because he couldn't stand the hypocrisy of colonialism. He chose poverty to understand the reality of the marginalized. He fought in the Spanish Civil War to defend his ideals, and, in the process, witnessed firsthand how truth can be manipulated to serve political narratives. Orwell was not an academic isolated in an ivory tower. He was on the battlefield, both, literally and figuratively, and it was this experience that shaped his writing and made his warnings so powerful. Today, more than ever, we need to understand his messages. Because, as he himself said, the moral to be drawn from this dangerous nightmare situation is a simple one. Don't let it happen. It depends on you. So let's dive into Orwell's life and legacy, because understanding his words may be the key to seeing the world more clearly and perhaps to resisting those who try to shape reality to their own convenience. To understand George Orwell's thinking, we need to go back to the beginning, to the childhood of Eric Arthur Blair, the man behind the pseudonym. From an early age, he lived in a world of contradictions. Born in 1903 in British India, he was part of a family that occupied a peculiar social position. They were not rich, but they were not exactly poor either. His father worked in the British colonial civil service, granting the family a respectable status, but without great luxuries. Orwell described his social position with an almost ironic term, lower upper middle class. This social ambiguity shaped his worldview. He grew up surrounded by aristocratic values, but without the financial privileges that sustained them. This made him aware, from an early age, of the hypocrisy of class divisions. He saw how British society was built on appearances, on a status game where truth was often ignored in favor of convenience. This perception would become one of the pillars of his work, the critique of power structures and how they manipulate reality. Orwell's education was a direct reflection of this social contradiction. He studied at some of England's most prestigious schools, such as Wellington and Eton, institutions that shaped the British elite. But unlike many of his peers, he never felt comfortable in that environment. Orwell was brilliant but unhappy. He realized that these schools were not just centers of learning, but also factories of conformity. The goal was not only to educate, but to mold young men so they would fit perfectly into the machinery of the British system. He saw how social hierarchy was reinforced from an early age, how the wealthiest and most influential students received privileges, while the less fortunate were constantly reminded of their place. This experience left a deep mark on him. He could have followed the traditional path, entered a prestigious university, and secured a comfortable position in society. But he chose a different path. He refused to follow the academic route and decided to explore the real world, a world he had only known from a distance. The first major decision of his adult life was to join the British Imperial Police in Burma, a British colony in Southeast Asia. For many, this was a natural choice for a young man of his social standing. But for Orwell, this experience would become a turning point. In Burma, he saw colonialism up close, and he did not like what he saw. He realized that the British Empire was not the civilizing force many believed it to be. On the contrary, it was a system of domination based on exploitation and violence. He found himself in the role of the oppressor, forced to enforce unjust rules on a people who did not want his presence there. This internal conflict consumed him. He later wrote about how he felt hatred for both the colonizers and the colonized, a hatred that, in reality, was a reflection of his own guilt. He knew he was part of a corrupt and inhumane system, but at the same time, he saw no immediate way out. After 5 years, he made a radical decision. He resigned from his position and abandoned colonial life. This choice was not just an act of rebellion, but a commitment to truth. He no longer wanted to be part of a system he considered morally bankrupt. Upon returning to Europe, Orwell could have used his experience to secure a respectable job. But instead, he chose an even harder path. He decided to live among the poor. He spent years wandering through Paris and London, working low-paying jobs, sleeping in shelters, and experiencing the life of those whom society ignored. He wanted to understand the reality of the marginalized, not through books or statistics, but by living as they did. This phase of his life was essential to his development as a writer. He realized that poverty was not just an economic issue, but also a psychological one. The poor were not just financially disadvantaged, they were invisible. Society treated them as if they did not exist, as if they were disposable pieces in a system that only valued those in power. This experience would be reflected in his early books, such as Down and Out in Paris and London and Burmese Days, where he exposed with brutal honesty the realities that many preferred to ignore. It was during this period that Eric Arthur Blair became George Orwell. The pseudonym was not just a literary choice, but a symbol of his transformation. He did not want to be just another writer. He wanted to be a voice against oppression, against the manipulation of truth, against systems that crushed the individual. And this journey was only beginning. Orwell's experience with poverty, colonialism, and social hierarchy prepared him for something even greater. He was about to witness firsthand one of the greatest political experiments of the 20th century, and to realize how truth could be distorted in ways he had never imagined. If Orwell's childhood and youth had taught him to question power structures, it was in the Spanish Civil War that he had his ultimate revelation. Until then, he had experienced poverty, witnessed the brutality of colonialism, and felt firsthand the contradictions of British society. But nothing prepared him for what he saw in Spain. The Spanish Civil War, 1936-1939, was one of the most ideologically charged conflicts of the 20th century. On one side were the Republicans, composed of socialists, communists, anarchists, and Democrats. On the other, the nationalists, led by General Francisco Franco, supported by Hitler and Mussolini. For many intellectuals of the time, the war was not just an internal Spanish conflict, it was a battlefield where the future of Europe was being decided. Orwell initially went to Spain as a journalist, but he soon realized that he could not simply observe. He enlisted in the militia of the POUM, Partido Obrero de Unificación Marxista, a revolutionary socialist group fighting against fascism. His motivation was clear. If you were to ask me why I joined the militia, I would answer, to fight against fascism. And if you asked me what I was fighting for, I would answer, common decency. This phrase encapsulates much of what Orwell believed. For him, the fight was not just political, it was moral. He did not see the conflict as a dispute between abstract ideologies, but as a battle between truth and lies, between freedom and oppression. But it was in Spain that Orwell had one of his most disturbing realizations. He not only witnessed the brutality of war, but also saw something even more insidious: the manipulation of truth. He saw with his own eyes how events were distorted to serve political interests. The press did not report facts as they happened, but as they should have happened, according to ideological narratives. He wrote, "I saw history being written not in terms of what happened, but of what ought to have happened, according to various party lines." This shocked him deeply. He realized that objective truth was being replaced by fabricated versions of reality. British and international newspapers published reports that did not match what he saw on the battlefield. Groups fighting side by side against Franco were portrayed as traitors. Inconvenient facts were erased. Lies were repeated until they became accepted as truth. At that moment, Orwell understood something that would become the core of his work. Truth is not just a collection of facts, it is a battlefield. Whoever controls the narrative controls reality. Orwell's experience in Spain did not end well. The POUM, the group he belonged to, was accused of treason by the communists, who were trying to consolidate control over the Republican movement. He and his wife were persecuted and had to flee Spain in a hurry, barely escaping imprisonment, or worse. This betrayal within the anti-fascist camp itself left a deep mark on him. He realized that totalitarianism was not exclusive to the right. The left could also be authoritarian, could also distort the truth, could also persecute those who did not fit perfectly into its ideology. This experience shaped his political vision forever. He remained a socialist, but rejected any form of authoritarianism. He came to see freedom of thought as the most essential value, and the manipulation of truth as the greatest threat to humanity. The Spanish Civil War was the definitive turning point in Orwell's life. He entered the war as an idealist and left it as a man who had seen firsthand how truth could be destroyed. This experience would become the foundation of his most famous works. Animal Farm and 1984 were not just fiction, they were warnings. He had seen how language could be used to distort reality, how slogans could replace critical thinking, how history could be rewritten to serve power. And he knew that if it could happen in Spain, it could happen anywhere. From that moment on, Orwell dedicated his life to a single purpose: exposing the manipulation of truth and warning the world about the dangers of totalitarianism. And that is exactly what he did. Orwell's experience in the Spanish Civil War transformed him forever. He had witnessed firsthand how truth could be distorted, how language could be manipulated, and how even those who claimed to fight for freedom could become oppressors. From that moment on, he dedicated his life to a single purpose: exposing the mechanisms of power and warning the world about the dangers of totalitarianism. And that is exactly what he did in his two most iconic works, Animal Farm and 1984. If there is one work that encapsulates Orwell's vision of politics and human nature, it is Animal Farm. Published in 1945, the book is a political fable that, at first glance, may seem like a simple story about animals on a farm. But in reality, it is a devastating allegory of the Russian Revolution and the rise of Stalin's regime. The story begins with a group of animals who, tired of human exploitation, revolt and take control of the farm. Inspired by ideals of equality and justice, they establish a new system where all animals are supposedly equal. But over time, the revolution begins to corrupt itself. The pigs, who assume leadership, gradually become as oppressive as the humans they had overthrown. The book's final sentence brilliantly summarizes this transformation. The creatures outside looked from pig to man, and from man to pig, and from pig to man again, but already it was impossible to say which was which. This conclusion delivers a brutal blow to the illusion that any revolution by itself can guarantee freedom. Orwell shows that the problem is not just who holds power, but the very structure of power itself. Without mechanisms to prevent abuse, any system can become oppressive, even those that begin with the best intentions. The book was an immediate success. Its accessible format and universal message made it widely read around the world. In its first year, it sold over 500,000 copies, an impressive number for the time. But the impact of Animal Farm went far beyond sales. It became one of the most powerful critiques of totalitarianism, being banned in several countries under authoritarian regimes. Its message was clear: power corrupts, and without constant vigilance, any revolution can become a new form of tyranny. But Orwell was not finished yet. If Animal Farm was a critique of the past, his next work would be a warning about the future, a future that, frighteningly, would become increasingly real. And thus, 1984 was born. If Animal Farm was a warning about how power corrupts and turns revolutions into new forms of oppression, 1984 was an even darker warning. What happens when state control becomes absolute? Published in 1949, 1984 was not just a dystopian fiction, it was a distorted mirror of the reality Orwell already saw. Emerging in the world, he had witnessed the manipulation of truth in the Spanish Civil War, observed the horrors of Stalinism and Nazism, and realized that technology and propaganda were becoming increasingly powerful tools for mass control. The book is set in the superstate of Oceania, a totalitarian regime where the party controls not only politics and the economy, but also reality itself. Truth is not determined by facts, but by what the party decides is true. The past can be rewritten, language can be altered, and even thoughts can be policed. The protagonist, Winston Smith, works at the Ministry of Truth, where his job is precisely to rewrite history so that it always aligns with the party's interests. But Winston begins to question the system, and by doing so, he becomes an enemy of the state, a crime that, in Oceania, cannot be forgiven. Throughout the book, Winston tries to resist the party's control. He falls in love, seeks the truth, and attempts to rebel, but in the end, he is captured and subjected to a brutal process of re-education. The final scene of the book is one of the most impactful in literature. 2 gin-scented tears trickled down the sides of his nose. But it was all right. Everything was all right. The struggle was finished. He had won the victory over himself. He loved Big Brother. Winston, who was once a rebel, is now completely indoctrinated. He not only obeys the party, he loves the party. His mind has been broken, his individuality destroyed. This ending is what makes 1984 so terrifying. Orwell offers no hope. He shows a world where the state can control not just the body, but also the mind. Decades later, 1984 remains one of the most read and studied books in the world. Its impact goes far beyond literature. It has shaped the way we think about politics, media, and technology. Today, we live in a world where digital surveillance is a reality, where misinformation spreads rapidly, and where language is constantly manipulated to serve political interests. Orwell was not writing about a distant future. He was writing about patterns that were already emerging and that, in many ways, continue to repeat. If Animal Farm warned us about how power corrupts, 1984 showed us what happens when power becomes absolute. And as Orwell warned us, don't let it happen. It depends on you. Orwell was not just a writer, he became an adjective. The term Orwellian entered the global vocabulary as a synonym for truth manipulation, extreme surveillance, and totalitarian control. Few authors have managed to capture, with such precision, the mechanisms of power and their consequences for society. Decades after his death, his works continue to be read, debated, and, most importantly, used as references to understand the modern world. Because if there is one thing Orwell taught us, it is that the fight for truth never ends. One of Orwell's greatest contributions to political and philosophical thought was his analysis of the power of language. He understood that whoever controls words controls how people think. In 1984, he introduced the concept of newspeak, a language designed to restrict critical thinking. The idea was simple but terrifying. If you eliminate words that express concepts, like freedom or rebellion, people will have a harder time conceiving those ideas. Today, we see echoes of this concept in how language is used to shape political and social narratives. Terms are redefined, meanings are distorted, and certain words become taboo. The goal? To control the perception of reality. This is why the term Orwellian has become so relevant. It describes any attempt to manipulate language and information for power, something Orwell predicted with chilling accuracy. One of the greatest ironies about Orwell is that he is often quoted by people who do not fully understand his political vision. Many believe he was a critic of socialism itself, when in fact, his fight was against totalitarianism, regardless of ideology. He made this clear in one of his most direct statements. Every line of serious work that I have written since 1936 has been written directly or indirectly against totalitarianism and for democratic socialism, as I understand it. Orwell did not reject the idea of social justice or equality. What he feared was authoritarianism disguised as a liberating ideology. He saw how totalitarian regimes, both right-wing and left-wing, used language, propaganda, and fear to consolidate power. His goal was not to defend a specific political system, but to warn about the dangers of any government that sought to control truth and suppress individual freedom. If there is proof of Orwell's impact, it is the fact that 1984 remains one of the most read and studied books in the world. In times of political crisis, its sales surge. Whenever governments try to control information, whenever truth becomes a battlefield, Orwell returns to the center of the debate. He predicted with remarkable clarity how the manipulation of language could shape reality. He showed us how slogans can replace critical thinking, how surveillance can become an instrument of control, and how truth can be erased and rewritten according to the convenience of power. But perhaps Orwell's most important lesson is this: freedom is never guaranteed. It must be defended constantly, because, as he warned us, if liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear. George Orwell did not just write stories, he left warnings. Warnings about how truth can be distorted, how freedom can be gradually eroded, and how power, when left unquestioned, always finds ways to expand. His books are not just fiction, they are mirrors. Mirrors that reflect patterns that repeat throughout history, and that, if we are not vigilant, can repeat again. Orwell showed us that truth is fragile, that freedom is never guaranteed, that political manipulation does not happen all at once, but gradually, until, when we finally realize it, we are already trapped inside a system that tells us what to think, what to say, and even what to feel. And that is why his work remains so relevant, because the mechanisms he exposed, surveillance, language manipulation, the rewriting of history, have not disappeared. They have only changed form. The question that remains is, are we paying attention to this? Are we questioning the narratives presented to us? Are we protecting our right to think freely? Orwell left us one final warning, a sentence that sums up his entire message. The moral to be drawn from this dangerous nightmare situation is a simple one. Don't let it happen. It depends on you. And that is the big question. What are we doing to ensure that this does not happen? Now, I want to hear your opinion. Do you think Orwell's predictions have come true? How do you see the influence of 1984 and animal farms in today's world? Leave your comment below. I read them all and really want to know what you think about this. If this video made you reflect, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. This helps us continue bringing deep content about literature, politics, and psychology. See you in the next video. Until then.